this topic I'm probably going to be coming at it, moving around a bit between different perspectives. So I guess the three kind of lines I'm taking on this are, I'm a trans man myself, I had a hysterectomy, I guess about 7 or 8 years ago now, fair enough, I'm struggling to remember how long ago. I've been quite involved in transmasculine communities in the UK, some of you may know me from that kind of sphere, and also I'm now based in academia. But this is kind of a topic where I find it difficult to stick to specifically academic perspectives only, and I'm going to come on in a little bit to why that is. So starting point, I don't think anyone here is anyone's particularly familiar with the English NHS in this level of detail. It's notoriously complicated to understand. The key point I'm trying to make here is that when it comes to English National Health Services, it's free at the point of use, but it's split up into different sections. The majority of NHS care is funded and commissioned at a local level. There's these things called clinical commissioning groups, CCGs, and they get money to provide services to specific local areas. That's what applies to most areas of primary care, most of secondary health care, things in your local hospitals. But there are certain areas where they've decided that actually this doesn't really work, it needs to be national level decisions, national level funding. Gender identity clinics in the UK, there was a big reorganisation about 5 years ago. Everything to do with gender identity services was moved into this specialised pot. And there's pros and cons of that, because moving it into the specialised pot means the decisions are taken nationally, not locally, so you shouldn't see that many inconsistencies. On the other hand, we've noticed very long waiting lists for gender identity services in the UK. There's now a bit of talk about whether or not more should be done in primary care. A bit of a pushback from the primary care physicians, and part of their argument is, well, hold on, you said all this stuff was specialised, why are we now being expected to do it? How are we supposed to do this stuff, which is supposedly now seen as very specialised? So just a bit of context there. And I'm coming on to this particularly in the topic of hysterectomies and fertility preservation, because both of these raise kind of issues with this national and local split. When it comes to the specialised surgeries, the idea of with the specialised surgeries around gender affirming surgeries is that there's only certain specified providers who can do them. And for some surgeries that makes perfect sense. With phalloplasty, you know, it is pretty specialised. There are only a certain number of people who can do it. You don't want your local hospital thinking, I'll have a go at that. But with hysterectomies, this raises problems, because actually, most gynaecology units should be able to do a hysterectomy. But once you put it in this specialised pot, what you're then supposed to do is say only certain providers can do it, and therefore that will reduce choice to trans people, because they would then have to go off to the named, dedicated providers. So there's a bit of a grey area, and the NHS has, to be honest, largely fudged this. It's still fudging it, and the latest version of the policy it just stopped mentioning hysterectomies, and not really made it clear what the pathway is. When it comes to fertility preservation, fertility services are definitely in the local pot, but the local pot is notoriously varied in this area. Even for cis and heterosexual couples, they will notice massive differences between one area and the next. You might get funding for 3 rounds of IVF in one area, move down the road and get nothing at all. And as you might expect, policies that aren't great for cis het couples often either haven't considered trans people at all, or in some cases are outright discriminatory. Certainly in the last few years we've seen policies that just say, except in the case of gender dysphoria. There's been a bit of a pushback, there was a legal challenge, which didn't ultimately go to court. They sort of settled it out of court for saying there will be new guidance saying you shouldn't be outright trans exclusionary on this. But, so these are both areas where this local national split raises problems. So, up until 2019, this was the NHS policy in the sort of national commissioning document for England on hysterectomies. And what this says is if you've been using testosterone on a continuous basis, you are at increased risk of developing endometrial hyperplasia, so thickening of the lining of the womb, and malignancy, so cancers. Trans men should be informed of this and should be strongly recommended to have hysterectomy and salpingo-oophorectomy, so removal of kind of all the internal reproductive organs within 2 to 5 years. That was the policy, that's what we were told. That version came in 2013, but even before then, that was kind of the general understanding. So there's never been a legal requirement in the UK for trans people to have sterilisation. We've never had laws mandating it. But there's been this quite strong medical message that this is necessary, that this is important, that you're at risk if you don't do so. So, what does the actual academic literature say on this? So this is sorry, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, because this was the point when actually I was going to start talking a little bit about why I'm having difficulty separating the academic and the personal with this. Because this is the kind of policy that was in place when I had my hysterectomy. This is the reason why I believed I was having my hysterectomy. Then I kind of moved into starting my PhD, and someone kind of approached me and sort of said they were quite worried. They'd been on testosterone for 5 years, they hadn't yet had a hysterectomy. Were they at risk? Did this mean that they were definitely going to get cancer? Was it a major risk for them? And I sort of thought, well, you're pretty young, you're pretty fit, you're not a smoker. I can't imagine your risk is going to be that high, but I'll look into the literature and I'll find out. And from what I was finding out, actually that kind of made me rethink my own previous decisions and what I decided was right for me. So, the literature, cold bundles and all. Trans people who are searching for information concerning their decisions to have reproductive organ surgery, so hysterectomy, will only find anecdotal material on the internet, limited amount of information, much of it conflicting, in the medical literature. They will not find any large study of trans men that addresses subjective experiences of hysterectomy, issues of post-operative hormone treatment, sexual satisfaction, or the potential for a graft. So, I mean, it's honest, but it's not exactly reassuring in terms of what is the quality of evidence out there. Major issues that are not covered. Then we've got some writing by Leighton Seal. Those of you in the UK may know Leighton as being an endocrinologist, quite well known in sort of trans healthcare. And he again talks a little bit about the evidence for and against hysterectomy. So reassuringly, there has only been one case of endometrial cancer reported in a trans man. So remember, the previous policy said reason was concerns about endometrial cancer. Only one case reported in a trans man on testosterone. Moreover, most of the studies looking at the wombs of trans men showed that the lining of the womb became thin and underdeveloped, not thick. So the concern was about thickening, but actually most studies have found it became thin. However, one study suggested that the lining of the womb could become thick in 15% of trans men, and so it's usual practice to recommend hysterectomy. So, okay, that seems to be where we're getting this recommendation from. One study, 15% of trans men had thickening. Anyone want to play guess the sample size on 15%? Because it's 3 out of 19. And it's not even from 1998, it was from an earlier study in 1986 that they cited in 1998. And quite a lot of the stuff in that paper is about how the sort of sample they were, or the trans people they were looking at, quite a lot of them had other gynae issues going on, some of that PCOS, other health needs. So, and I mean, you know, I'm trying to be as fair as possible as I can be. Limited evidence, they were wanting to be risk averse, they were wanting to sort of, you know, work as well as they could with the evidence they had. You know, obviously there is some risk. On the other hand, I think as someone who sort of teaches people about public health, I think if a student came back to me and said, hysterectomy should be mandatory on the basis of 3 out of 19 patients, I'd probably turn that away as a first year essay. That's not really what we would consider to be an acceptable standard of evidence. They've had best part of over 30 years since 1986. They could probably have looked into it a little bit further. And the other thing to say about endometrial cancers is they're very heavily age linked. So we're talking about recommendations within 2 to 5 years, but actually endometrial cancer, if you're under 30, your risk is very, very low. If you're under 40, your risk is pretty low. It starts picking up when you're in your 50s and 60s. So we're talking about recommendations to a 20-year-old, 25-year-old, 30-year-old, who are quite often the ages of people who go through gender identity clinics as transmasculine people. Saying within 2 to 5 years, you know, the risk within 2 to 5 years is probably not that high. There would probably be a case for saying there could be a risk, it's later in life, you could wait a bit. If, you know, if there are other pressing reasons you want to move ahead with a hysterectomy. And I'm not saying anything new here. This is the WPATH Standards of Care version 7, so it came out in 2012. They've got this category at the bottom for no increased risk or inconclusive, for various risks related to different hormone therapies. And they've got cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, all listed in that no increased risk or inconclusive. Now it's important to note, I'm not saying there's no risk. There clearly is always going to be some risk while you've got those parts. Something could happen. And as it stands, the data is just rubbish. The data is just awful. What I am saying is that the level of risk shown in the data is not yet at the stage where we should probably be telling people you must have surgery within 2 to 5 years. And I think the reason for the persistence of this kind of recommendation is probably because people have had a blind spot around trans fertility and around the fact that actually having children might be important to people. I think the only way you could have really come up with this kind of recommendation is if you were starting from the assumption that, of course, trans men and transmasculine people wouldn't want to be having children. So there are a few studies which have actually gone out and spoken to trans people about this. Radical, I know, but Rachel did actually go out and do quite a large survey with some transmasculine people about, have they had a hysterectomy, reasons for it, reasons not to have it, and their sort of, whether or not they were satisfied afterwards. I think one of the things to note is this was an international study, largely US-based kind of sample, and therefore most people have paid for their hysterectomies. Average cost of about $10,000. I think there's a bit of a difference between the reasons why someone who paid $10,000 for a hysterectomy might have proceeded with a hysterectomy versus the people who were being told in the UK that you have to have it and the NHS will make it available for free. I would expect that in the people who've gone out of their way to pay for it themselves, there may be a higher instance of people who are having other gynecological problems as well, other reasons they wanted to move ahead with hysterectomy, possibly. Much smaller qualitative study from the Netherlands, where they spoke to some young trans boys. That was just after the law there had changed on sterilisation, and what they found was that actually after the law changed, trans boys were saying, well, in the past we might have gone ahead with this, but now we don't really see the need. Again, quite a small quality study, but I think what that does suggest is that some of these decisions around hysterectomy are being made on the basis of wider contingent contextual factors, rather than necessarily because the individual sees that as something that's important for their own gender transition. So I guess, and this is much more kind of impressionistic. What are the kind of conversations I've had with people about my own hysterectomy, about other people's, conversations I've had probably over the last 10 to 15 years. So quite often people talk to you about things that have nothing to do with testosterone whatsoever. They've had other gynecological problems, things like endometriosis, and indeed, we know that there's lots of problems for cis women as well in accessing good gynecological care on these issues. Often trans seems to be an additional complication, an additional thing while the gynecology services looks at it and goes, this is too complicated, can't deal with it. Cramping on orgasm seems a very common thing to happen to people once they've been on testosterone for a while. There's very little about it in the medical literature. I can personally say it happens. I've heard other people saying it happens. It seems to be one reason why people do want to go ahead with hysterectomy, but there's nothing in the medical literature that really says that's the only way of dealing with it, or that's the best way of dealing with it, or that there aren't other options for dealing with it. Again, other issues around sort of breakthrough bleeding, but then there are other ways of controlling that. Sexual satisfaction. Kate was talking earlier about lack of access to things like smear tests, so some people think, well, okay, I'll just have everything out and then I don't have to worry about that stuff. Dysphoria, for some people, knowing those organs are there is a major problem. For some people it isn't. Personally, it wasn't something that I ever felt particularly strongly about. I was always pretty sure I wasn't going to have other lower surgeries, so frankly what was going on inside I wasn't that fussed about. And then worries about unplanned pregnancy, though again, as was mentioned earlier, there's new guidance on long-acting contraception in trans people, and that may again be another route of addressing some of these things, rather than needing to go into hysterectomy. So there has been more interest recently about fertility preservation. That's coming up much more often in the literature. It's interesting, I would say, that conversations about fertility preservation always seem to turn into conversations about gamete storage, gamete freezing, to the extent that I've picked up surveys about fertility preservation that only ask about gamete freezing. And that's kind of very much as something that's then being added into the sort of traditional linear transition narrative. So you freeze your gametes, then you go on to your testosterone, then you have your hysterectomy, then you, if you're having other surgeries. So it's kind of still assuming that you'll probably go on to have a hysterectomy. But in practice, certainly in the UK, there isn't very good access to services where you can talk through these different options. So gender identity clinics, as we've mentioned, have really long waiting lists. Because of this split between national and local funding, your national gender identity clinic is not necessarily going to know what services you can get funded in your local area. They probably aren't seeing your partner. Their gatekeeping role, they have this kind of role where they're approving you for hormones or not. If you're waiting for 2 or 3 years to get there, you may feel like if you're going to bring up fertility preservation as well, that's another barrier to moving ahead with getting access to hormones. Primary care, how much they know about trans issues, how much they know about fertility issues is likely to be very variable. They tend to work on a short appointment basis. They're not necessarily set up for a long chat with you about fertility options. Fertility clinics presumably know about the fertility stuff, may know much less about the specialist needs of trans people, and also getting referred to them probably requires you to have certainly already gone through your GP, quite possibly already gone through the gender clinic. So there isn't necessarily an obvious site where you have an upfront, early discussion about what the options available to you are. And actually, again, possibly this is where it gets a bit more personal again, I get quite annoyed with this argument that fertility preservation is about freezing eggs. Because I think actually, had I frozen an egg, what good would that have done me? My partner's a cis man. So okay, between us, frozen egg, sperm, we could have made a viable embryo. But he can't get pregnant. I've had a hysterectomy, so I can't get pregnant. So we're then in some kind of surrogacy situation. The UK does allow surrogacy, but it's not commercial surrogacy, it has to be altruistic. So you're relying on someone to volunteer, either a family member or a friend, or to try and, there's sort of websites where you can try and find volunteers. Not necessarily sure how open those are going to be to trans situations, or are you going overseas? You're then into a much more expensive situation. So actually, I don't think a frozen egg would have done me that much good. If anything, it might be more of a problem knowing that that was there and I couldn't use it. Obviously, some people are with partners who can get pregnant, but then if they have a partner who can get pregnant, it's possible their partner might also have eggs, in which case using your frozen egg is potentially then puts you into a clinical, medical route rather than some kind of DIY donor arrangement. So certainly egg freezing is important for some people, for those who want it. If biological children are really important, it keeps options open. I'm not convinced that it's the only solution. I think there are some trans people not having hysterectomies, pushing back on this narrative of you must have a hysterectomy within this many years, may be a more effective route for some people for keeping their options open. So in terms of what we need, I think much of this isn't probably going to come as much as a surprise. We could talk about it over the course of the days, but prompt access to appropriate care, data that is grounded in trans people's priorities and in what trans people want and need and what they think about why they're having hysterectomies, rather than cis assumptions about who should be and when. Advice that sort of actually can deal with issues around uncertainty and poor data. Yes, there are some questions we don't know the answer to, so how are we going to have conversations about these? Thinking about whether in some cases other access to other aspects of gynecological care might preempt some of the need for hysterectomies. Yeah, perhaps in some cases more inclusive smear services, better access to contraception advice could help avoid some surgeries. And I think a really important one is opportunities to have these conversations without being weaponised. I think we're all aware of the current media and social media situation. I'm always really conscious of it when talking about this stuff. I talk about my own feelings, about interventions I have had and perhaps shouldn't have had, that I don't want to get wrapped up in some narrative of regrets and detransition and desistance, because I'm certainly not in any of those brackets, but I do think I was badly advised on a medical procedure I had, and I want to be able to talk about that, and I want to be able to talk about that, you know, in a way that doesn't shut down opportunities for other people. So how do we deliver? We've had some really good examples over the course of the last few days. I'm sure we'll hear others about trans-led clinics, trans-led services. I think those are really important. I think there's a question about how do we move them out, you know, to rural areas, areas where populations are more geographically dispersed. NHS England and NHS Wales are now pushing more towards primary care-based services. You know, I think we need to make sure that things like reproductive and gynecological care, contraceptive care, get built in at those stages. I think it's worth noticing that trans communities actually are quite strongly interconnected, generally pretty IT savvy. Actually, I don't think public health services make enough use of, you know, mechanisms of getting messages out to people via online resources, you know, thinking innovatively about how we can get messages out to people, you know, in a dispersed format. I've perhaps been a bit optimistic with the last point, but this is on my radar as something I really think we do need more research on. If anyone would like to talk to me in the breaks or at some later point about any way we can get something moving, I would really love to talk to other people who are interested in this issue. And I will finish there.